So I'd next like to thank our advisory committee, thanking and paying honor to them. Have had such a lovely group of people working with us to plan this event before you today. I just want to give honor to all of them, and especially to Minka and our community services department, who was doing a lot of the back end work. Just want to read through these names very quickly. We have Tori Anthony with the City of Palo Alto. We have Ann Cribbs with the Parks and Recreation Commission. Pinky Fung with Avenidas, Rochelle Kirshner, a board member at the Palo Alto Community Childcare. We have Lillian Horn with My Digital Tattoo, LaShonda Kennedy, and previously Christina as well with the Junior League of Palo Alto, Mid-Peninsula. Stephen Lee, Cities for CEDAW. Yoslyn Zavela Lopez, Adolescent Counseling Services. Raven Malone, Electrical Engineer, California Delegate for District 24. Abigail Milne, Palo Alto Youth Council, our Director of Community Services, Kristen O'Kane, Christina Hood Sanchez with the Junior League, Louise Valente, the League of Women Voters, Palo Alto Chapter, as I mentioned, Minka, and Kate Young with Alta Housing. So if everyone can give a virtual round of applause for all of them, I just really appreciate the effort and work they put into today's event, and just making it a great opportunity for everyone to participate and collaborate. So jumping into why we're here today, background on this event. The city has engaged in race and equity work since last June. With the City Council's leadership, we are working towards the adopted mission statement that the City of Palo Alto is committed to creating a respectful, fair, and professional workplace and city. We will identify prejudices, eliminate inequities, welcome many perspectives, and use a collaborative approach to create an environment that works for everyone. The city's commitment to achieve equity in Palo Alto is the shared responsibility of our residents, organizations, governments, and other institutions. Our most recent race and equity update went to the City Council Policy and Services Committee this past Tuesday. If you're interested in learning more about the city's efforts, you can read that report or go to our race and equity webpage where we have updates there as well. I'll paste both of those links in the chat for you in just a moment. And of note, we currently have a community conversations going on through our Human Relations Commission's 100 Community Conversations About Race initiative. I'll paste that link in the chat as well, but it's 100conversations.net. This summit today is linked to our larger effort to focus on equity in our community, since we're seeing the conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion being all inclusive. Why this event today? The goal of our event today is a community, we're thinking about this as a community grounded in opportunity and equity for women and girls. What we want to see today, or our desired outcome, is to organize this summit as a starting point to inform, mobilize, and energize the city and community towards greater opportunity and equity for women and girls, all inclusively speaking. Our purpose today is to educate, motivate to act on issues facing women and girls, to hear about the experiences of local women and girls, and to identify areas of strength and determine areas of need that we can continue to work on. This summit came about as a result of the City Council discussing CEDAW. What is CEDAW and why is it connected to this summit? CEDAW is an acronym for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. It's an international human rights treaty adopted in 1979 by the United Nations, and it's been signed by 187 countries, but not yet the United States. Cities have been taking actions to advance the CEDAW goals. Locally, the Human Relations Commission shared a recommendation with the City Council to consider local action on CEDAW. The City Council Policy and Services Committee responded to staff proposals of some of the first actions to learn more about the issues facing women and local girls in the community connected to the city's work on race and equity. With the input and direction of the Policy and Services Committee, we are here today, and the City Council as a whole. This summit is a good first step in learning about the issues facing local women and girls, and we will also be able to see who else is working on this topic area, what gaps we have, and what opportunities for collaboration and further action we can all do going forward. So now I'm introducing Ms. Lori Mackenzie. Lori Mackenzie is a speaker, researcher, and change agent in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is co-founder of the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab, which creates impact research to understand the barriers to women's advancement in order to build more inclusive workplaces and empower change agents. Lori is also lead strategist, diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where she works to foster a more diverse community, create an inclusive classroom and campus experience, and focus on voices underrepresented in efforts to date. Working with colleagues across GSB, Lori fosters a small wins approach to change by supporting colleagues to take bold yet doable actions. Super important. This year, they are building momentum to deliver progress on the action plan for racial equity. Lori is a keynote speaker to a wide range of audiences, from executive teams to women's summits like ours today. Lori was featured as one of BBC's 100 Women in 2017, and she was interviewed for the award-winning documentary Bias, which premiered in 2018. Her work has been published in the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times Incorporated, Fast Company, and the San Francisco Chronicle. In 2020, Lori was awarded the CEDAW Human Rights Award, Education, from the San Francisco Department on the Status of Women. Prior to her current roles, Lori served as the executive director of the Stanford Clayman Institute for Gender Research. Lori brings 20 years of marketing strategy and business management experience at companies including Procter & Gamble, Apple, eBay, and PayPal. She is a board member of the Alliance for Girls and Watermark and an advisor to the Center for Institutional Courage. She has an MBA from the Wharton School of Business and a BA in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Go Bears, I'm sure she'd say. She is sheltering in place with her partner, a teenager, and 2 dogs while gardening with renewed vigor, as we all know the experience of sheltering in place. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Lori Mackenzie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I so appreciate all of the work being done in our city to make it better, more inclusive. And so welcome to all of my neighbors who are here, the people who are making our city great, and also my partner is here, Andrew Mackenzie. So hi, Andrew. And I wanted to go through a talk with you today. Sometimes when we think about the ideas of equity, we think about equity over there, like let's make the city more equitable. And this talk is going to switch the lens a little bit and have us first start with thinking about how we're entering the conversation and ways that we can enact more equitable actions, thoughts, behaviors every day. This is something that I try to do myself, knowing that if we're not active in the work, we sometimes can be unconsciously implicit in creating less equitable workplaces and organizations. So let me go ahead and share. As you know, when you share, it's really hard to see everybody. So if you want to put something in chat, please do. And if I don't see it, I will try to pause periodically and make sure that I give a moment to see any questions you have or comments you want to make along the way. And there will be a little bit of an opportunity for you to weigh in on chat if you so wish to do. So the topic we decided to cover today is intersectionality in COVID. I'll explain a little bit more what those terms mean and other terms as well as we go through this presentation. I wanted to start with this quote from the Brookings Institute. It speaks a little bit to why we're specifically talking about COVID in relationship to our idea of more equitable living situations. COVID-19 is hard on women because the US economy is hard on women. And this virus excels at taking existing tensions and ratcheting them up. So what this quote really tries to get at is the historical ways that women often do bear more of the brunt of dealing with inequities, and why some things like the CEDAW Convention are important to remind us that our work is to try to continually mitigate those disadvantages. So when we think about some of the impacts of COVID, I was trying to find icons that matched all of the ways that women in particular are facing more disadvantages, facing more barriers during COVID. That could include when our schools were closed, the primary responsibility for homeschooling has fallen on women. It could include dealing with social unrest like Black Lives Matter or the Stop AAPI hate that we've looked at this year in particular. It could include the Zoom fatigue, which colleagues at Stanford have identified Zoom can be more challenging and more difficult for women to deal with. Mental health concerns for ourselves and our community, dealing with the ways that COVID has impacted the health of other members of our family and community. And so when you think about who is at the intersection of all of these concerns, while we share them as a community, in general, women tend to bear a larger responsibility and care for our community, for mental health, for our families. So where does that leave us? One question I wanted to have us consider is, which women are dealing with these inequities and how are they dealing with it? And I might even say, instead of which women, which people identifying as women, broadly defined, are at the center of all of these intersecting concerns. So when I say intersections, I mean it in a very particular way. Intersectionality is a term that was crafted by scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. It was a term she developed to try to help us understand how to see and manage difference. What she wanted to create was an analytical frame that would help us see the unique positionality of Black women and other women of color, both in civil rights law and civil rights movements. So when I say women, and then I say broadly defined, if I don't think and see through an intersectionality lens, what can inadvertently happen is that the solutions we develop help some women, but not all women. So intersectionality tries to get at the edges of our concerns, our barriers, so that we can ensure to encompass everybody versus inadvertently only supporting a few. So the approach I'm going to go through with us today, I'm going to make sure I leave some time for open Q&A, is an approach where we learn about the nature of advantages and disadvantages. You might think about it as vulnerabilities we have that make us more prone to experience the downside of, for example, a pandemic or other issues that are facing us in society. And then there'll be some time for us to reflect how you and I are entering the conversation. And what I'd like for us to do is to end with allyship. Allyship for one another, allyship for women who are now seen through this intersectionality lens, allyship to make our city be as inclusive and welcoming to everybody, as welcoming as we can be. So let's start with that learning and reflecting. When I do DEI work, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion work, often we want to say, let's fix something over there. Let's fix that process over there. But I find that the people who are the most engaged in doing this work really start with themselves and learn about how they are entering the conversation. And this is something I had to do as well. I always thought as an Asian American, now as a middle-aged Asian American, as a woman, that I had a lot of these experiences myself. But what I've done, especially in the past few years, is really try to understand the differences in how people enter the conversation. And through understanding the different ways we enter conversations, trying to craft solutions, by understanding not only how I enter, but how I enter is different than how others enter. That understanding can help me drive more change, and I hope will help you drive more change wherever you are. So let's start with this idea of our identities. So we have a multifaceted identity that in many ways has been developed by what we push up against, the barriers we face, the situations we face, make aspects of our identity salient, and they come into view. And I'll give one example. When I was little, and back then there was no internet, the big moment of my day during the summer, so long summer breaks, was once a week, my mom would take me to the library and I got to pick as many books as I wanted to for the week, as long as I could carry them. And it was just always the most special day, just a day full of anticipation. And one day when we were walking to the library, a car slows down in front of us. A man leans out of the window. He creates kind of what I would call fake Asian eyes and starts shouting fake Asian sounds at us in kind of a threatening way. And I look up at my mother. Now, there's one thing you have to know about my mom, and we've talked about this story since then. My mother was so inclusive that we weren't allowed to say, well, that's a dumb idea, because that would imply that we valued a certain level of intelligence as better than a different level of intelligence. And she did not want us to use any word that would imply that someone was more important or less important based on who they were. This mother, when that person leaned out of the window and made those fake noises, she flipped him off. I had never seen my mother do something like that. But that shaped an element of my identity that I didn't really understand before. It shaped me as what is often called a hyphenated American. I was very clear at that moment that I was an Asian American or Japanese American. And I also started to develop my identity as a change agent, knowing that it was something I wanted to do, like my mom, stand up for who we are. So before that moment, my sense of myself didn't include that hyphenation, and pushing up against that event, it did. Now, the thing about our identities is that they do change over time. So I wanted to have us reflect for a moment. And if you are open to putting it into chat, what is an element of identity that is important to you? No, is important to you. What is an element of identity that is important to you? So for me, it's being Japanese American, it's being a change agent. I've listed some elements of identity that people include. You don't have to use those, but perhaps notate for yourself. What is an element of identity that's important to you? Right, so it could be the role that you are at work, your profession. It could be your ethnic or racial identity. It could be your citizen status, whether you're first generation or whether you have been, your family has been in the United States longer. It could be your gender. It could be your parental status, your life experience, your profession. So these are, again, if you think about profession, that wasn't something you were born with. It was something that you developed over time and maybe even switched. So I've been in marketing and I've been working at a university, two very different professions. But what part of my identity did I keep and what part was a reflection of the work I was doing, right? So being a single parent, right, great. And what you can see is on this call, we share a lot of what's important to us, as you would imagine. So thank you. You please go ahead and keep entering. I'm gonna keep going, but it doesn't mean that we as a community aren't going to really value what you're saying into the chat. Now, there's a difference between how you see yourself and your experiences in the world. And you might say, for example, that who and how I define myself is my identity, but how I'm seen in the world could be a summation of my status characteristics. So for example, I might walk into a room like this, and part of my identity that might be important to me is being a Palo Alto resident. But when I walk into Starbucks or if I walk down the street, when the person is consciously or unconsciously engaging with me, they're probably not thinking directly, oh, she's a Palo Alto resident. they might interact with me consciously or unconsciously as a average height, middle-aged Asian woman. If I'm with my tall kids, they might say, oh, she's looks like a parent of a tall adult child. So how you are interacted with can be very different than how you see yourself. And those status characteristics, and I use that term to mean, unbeknownst to us, people are sorting us into how we can be categorized into what might be called a status category. That creates advantages and disadvantages for me, whether I want them or not, whether I identify with that or not. And in a time like COVID, that can create certain vulnerabilities that I might not even want or know is happening to me, but those vulnerabilities can result in a different life experience for me based on my status characteristics. Okay. So you can think about status characteristics having a different outcome for me based on how closely society, not how closely how closely society sees my status characteristic being linked to power and privilege. And the further out I get from power and privilege, creating more vulnerabilities for me, more disadvantages for me, or even marginalizations for me, not because I don't value that part of my identity, and I hope I value that part of my identity, but because that shapes the outcomes that I have based, again, on these shared status characteristics or ways that my self is being seen and categorized in society. Let me give you a few examples of how that works amongst a few dimensions. So when I think about gender, and we look as researchers who study who has advantages, who has disadvantages, or even marginalizations, this is an example of how society might interact with me based on my gender. So it's Pride Month. And I want to say, if you don't know any of these terms, that might be one action you can take for Pride Month, is to educate yourself on terms used by the Pride community to define themselves, right? But if we think about, for example, a cisgender man, cisgender means that your sex at birth matches your gender expression today. So cisgender men would be the closest to having power and privilege, and the TGNC community would be the ones grappling with most marginalization. TGNC is trans, gender nonconforming community. Now, one time when I was doing this presentation, a mother said, my daughter is gender nonconforming. She doesn't see herself as disadvantaged. And I said, absolutely not. I'm not talking about how you see yourself. I'm talking about the barriers you have to face. So for example, if she wants to, or she or they want to use the restroom, is the restroom set up for them? Or I even just did the slip. If they want to use the pronoun they, how many times do they have to keep explaining to people that they use a they pronoun? So again, it's not that we don't value people from the TGNC community. It's how many barriers do they have to go through just to live their lives? Barriers that a cisgender man does not have to deal with. Even back to the restroom example, I recall a story from Lean In where Sheryl Sandberg explained she was on a board and there were no women's restrooms on the floor where the board meeting was being held. Again, something that cisgender men did not have to deal with, something that even cisgender women would have to deal with, right? So it's not what you value about yourself and what we intend to value as a society, but how these barriers exist for people even when we don't realize that they're existing. Okay, thinking about education. You might consider post-secondary education as the closest to power and privilege, and an elementary school education as the furthest away from power and privilege. When I think about the impacts of COVID, the fact that I have post-secondary education and have a professional job means that I could work from home. I could feel safe, that I could take the precautions needed to feel safe during COVID. Again, it's not whether I am proud or value anyone's education, but it presents certain opportunities for me to feel less vulnerable, especially during a pandemic or a crisis like we've just been experiencing. And lastly, think about body size. Our society has implicit biases that prefer people who are slim to people who are large. Again, this isn't what we value. I love there's a moment in Shonda Rhimes' book where she talks about being very proud of who she is. Now, what do I mean about disadvantages for people who are larger? Well, once when we were traveling, I was on an airplane and the person in the middle aisle needed a seatbelt extender. And she was politely raising her hand and the flight attendant ongoingly ignored her and wasn't seeing what she needed. So I asked her, like, oh, is there something you need? And she said, I need one of those seat extenders. And she was acting a kind of, quiet, like really holding herself in, holding herself very, very low. And so since I was on the aisle, I stopped the flight attendant and said, excuse me, my friend here needs a seatbelt extender. And the flight attendant acted as if she were being inconvenienced, like, I have a lot to do, I'll get to her when I have a moment. Again, this person did not ask to have to raise her hand, have a person respond to her that way, have to have me block the aisle to get her what she needed. So thinking about the marginalization she experienced, it wasn't because she doesn't value who she is as a larger woman. It was how the barriers shaped her experiences and outcomes. So one thing I wanted to have us reflect on, and this is something created by a resource in Canada, where they looked at the different elements and thought, how close are you to power and privilege? And how close are you to an ism like sexism, racism, ageism? And so they shaped a chart that helped people see the elements of their identity that might be closer to an advantage or closer to marginalization. This is where intersectionality is really seen. We might say, well, as a woman, I experience some element of disadvantage. I must share an all women's experience. But then if I look, I might have a lot of advantages. So intersectionality has us see that even if we have one disadvantaged identity, we might share a lot of advantages. Or we might have one element of marginalization that we see ourselves through and realize there aren't a lot of people like us. That's why I've been experiencing what I've been experiencing. So one moment of reflection I'd like for us to take is to think about how many elements you have that are an advantage, a disadvantage, or a marginalized identity. So just take a moment and just think for yourself. I myself have gone through this list and thought, for my family members, for myself, where might we sit in this intersectionality table? And then another question I have to reflect on, in how many of the marginalized categories are you yourself, or do you know somebody? I'm on the board of Alliance for Girls, and one of my board members is very publicly a formerly incarcerated woman. And she talks about how in many spaces, she is the first formerly incarcerated person people have ever met. And in her community, she knows many formerly incarcerated people. And it made me realize the own state of my power and privilege, that that's not a common experience for me. I often also ask, how many times have you had somebody from one of these marginalized communities in your home, or welcomed them to share a cup of coffee or tea with you? Right? It's one thing to know somebody, but how far have you let them in? I had to do some of this reflection for myself. I remember there's a famous writer, Joe Loya, who was also formerly incarcerated, and he came to our home one time, and I remember thinking, wow, I've never had someone who was formerly incarcerated in my home. Like, that was something I wanted to be more open to as I work on this equity work, ensuring that I not only know people, but that they're part of my life, whether no one comes in my house right now because of COVID, but someone that I would have a private social moment with. Doing this work, expanding who's included with us, is part of the equity work to create a more inclusive city. Okay. So when I think about how this conversation comes together, we started with intersectionality and COVID. So what we know is that when you are part of a marginalized community, it makes you more vulnerable to the impacts of a pandemic, to different societal pressures. So when we start to think about the value of CEDA, the value of our work on equity, often we have to not only say, well, this is how I experience it or how my colleagues experience what's going on. We have to have the ability to see through something like an intersectionality wheel to understand, right? Thank you, Teresa, for sharing that and being very vulnerable. How can we design our solutions not for who most people are, but who all people are, including thinking about these marginalizations? Okay. I love this quote from Rumi. You have to keep breaking your heart until it opens. Really getting the experience of people, including people on our calls, including me, including my partner, of what it's like to experience these disadvantages and ensuring that we start from there. Now, there's no gender difference in how open our hearts can be, but I do think that society has socialized women to have permission to be more vulnerable, to have our hearts broken. And so because of that, I do believe this work of equity, women are particularly suited to do. Men, absolutely, you're suited to do as well, but we're given more permission to openly have our heart broken. Now, my husband and I often talk about this. He has his heart broken as well, but it's interesting that I am more likely to feel that I can publicly have these expressions. What would society look like if all of us, of all genders, expansively defined, could openly have our heart broken in order to create change that truly benefits all? That would be a remarkable world where in our classrooms, kids were equally invited to be vulnerable, as some of you have been in sharing today. At work, where we were equally open to being vulnerable, to considering the experiences of everyone, not just the people who thrive automatically in our workplaces, but thinking about the experience of those who have the will, but because of these disadvantages are facing barriers to thriving in our workplace. Having your heart broken to truly be able to stand in someone's shoes and see their point of view. That's where the work of equity begins. I want to talk a moment about allyship. So when we think about the work of CEDA, the work of gender equity, it begins both with fighting for our own access to power and privilege, but also being an ally to those who are facing barriers to having power and privilege in our society. One of the things we have to think about is whether or not we, at this very moment, have a good intention, okay? You and I likely have, in this very moment, a good intention to be as equitable as possible. We can't ignore that historical or past-based barriers are existing at this current time. If we ignore that, then we can't truly create an equitable space around us. So in what ways is the past and the present? I want to start with this optical illusion. You might have seen it before. It was created by William Ely Hill. He said, I wanted to draw a picture that had both my wife and my mother-in-law in it at the same time. So you can possibly see a younger looking face or an older looking face. Some people can only see one of them. Some people can see both. The good news is that when you can truly see both, your brain is likely to never be able to unsee it again. I saw this optical illusion as a child, for example, and then when I saw it again as an adult, it took me a little time, but then I really could see both faces. And right now I can toggle between the younger and older face. So what we're going to do is see if we can take our own perspective, but also take a different perspective in thinking about creating more equitable spaces around us. Now, this is a curb. And if I were walking, let's say in San Francisco or downtown Palo Alto for 10 minutes, and at the end of the 10 minutes, you asked me, how many curbs did you walk up and down? I probably wouldn't remember. It doesn't even occur to me that I'm stepping up and down except to make sure that I'm crossing the street safely. Because I, in that intersectionality grid, have the privilege of not having a disability, right? So for someone who doesn't have a stroller or a disability, this is not even something we consider. It's not even visible as a barrier. And yet the Americans with Disability Act took a different perspective. They said people have a right to walk safely across really big intersections that might be hazardous at this time to people who are blind, people with a wheelchair, people with other physical disabilities. And so they created the concept of this curb cut. Now the bumps are designed to help people who are blind to be aware that an intersection is coming. And then the curb cut enables people with wheelchairs or other disabilities not to have to deal with that barrier called a curb. Now, this curb cut was designed to help people who needed them, but it turns out it does more than that. It helps, for example, parents with strollers, delivery people with large carts that they need to get up and down on the curb. It can help people with bicycles. So there was an intersection where my daughter went from a side street across Embarcadero, and to get to the crosswalk, she had to go a little bit on the sidewalk to get across it. So people with bicycles often need a little section of the sidewalk to navigate to get to a safe crossing. So this curb cut, the original intention of which was to support people with disabilities, turns out to support many more people. So when we think about designing strategies for equity, we often need to switch our perspective of not thinking about what I need, but seeing through this intersectionality lens, who could we support as an ally to have strategies and solutions that work for them? I love this quote by Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that the source of inequity is not ignorance or hate, but self-interest. That the status quo kind of works for many people. And this kind of working for many people is our own self-interest. So the question is, how can we move from our self-interest to a collective interest that benefits all? I just wanted to share how this plays out today. So when I was looking for icons to use in that wheel, what I presented in the beginning about how COVID has impacted us through different ways, I wanted an icon for unemployment. I'm going to pause for a minute and ask you if you want to put into chat, what do you notice? And this is the first page of my Google search for the term unemployment icon. What do you notice? What's interesting about the images that show up in the first page of this unemployment icon search? Any comments you can put into chat? Exactly, mostly male, mostly men. Did you notice they're mostly professional workers because they have briefcases, they have boxes of things they've obviously carried from an office. So These ideas of whose image of an employment is most important to put as a symbol to everyone else. We have the past stereotypes influencing it. So single parents and single breadwinners and primary breadwinners, 40% of single breadwinners and primary breadwinners are women. And yet when we think about people who are employed and whose employment is important, even today, the symbols, the images, the past still dominates who we see through that lens. So it's important for us, and again, thank you for all of you who put into chat. It's really important for us to constantly look at how these societal past-based trends influence how we shape solutions, even well-intentioned people and unbeknownst to us. Okay. So allyship breaks down barriers and makes power and privilege more equitable. First, you have to be able to see the barriers. For example, that winners are women and men, not just men, and that they're not just in professional work. We have to first be able to see barriers to break them down in order to make power and privilege more equitable. So allyship isn't being friendly towards inclusion or equity. Allyship is action, and often it's the act of giving up power and privilege in order to make it more equitable. Just wanted to outline a few of the small acts that we can all do to make power and privilege more equitable, and then I'm going to leave some time for us to have an open Q&A. I really want to hear from everyone. So one thing you can do is invite perspectives in. On a very micro level, on a personal level, you can be curious about those around you. In one time when I presented this grid, someone said, well, maybe somebody is in a marginalized identity and they've just never shared it with me. Interesting. What would it be like to be somebody for whom people shared all of their identity with you, not just the shiny, glossy ones? It doesn't start by saying, tell me about your marginalized identities. It really starts with being curious, inviting conversations just to learn more, by telling your own story, being vulnerable, and creating space for others to tell theirs. It could include making sure that you include all voices. Who has a seat at your own table? Who has a seat at the table you're at work? What can you do to increase the diversity of your own friends, your colleagues, and your networks? So Rick Clow, who is the current Chief Technology Innovation Officer of the state of California, used to work at Google Ventures. And he became on the board of the Anita Borg Institute, which advances women in technology. And when he got on the board, he wanted to think about who he was most connected with. So he created an algorithm that helped him get an estimate of the percent of men and percent of women he was connected to on his LinkedIn network. And as somebody who worked at a pretty prestigious place, who had access to resources, he shared job opportunities, he shared different ways people could get recognition. He was curious to see whether his LinkedIn network was equally divided between men and women, for example. What he discovered was that his network tended to be about 75 to 80% men, 20 to 25% women, which meant when he presented these opportunities, he wasn't sharing it equally with people in society, but with the way his biases had shaped who he connects to. He did the same for his Twitter feed, other social media, and discovered, again, he was more likely to follow on Twitter a man than he was a woman. So of course, that was something that he was able to take action with and ensure that at a minimum, he was increasing the diversity of his network. I had to do this work myself. I had to make sure that I had women broadly defined in my Twitter feed, LinkedIn feed, other social network feeds that I'm on. You can demand diversity around you. So one of the things that you can do is, if you're in a position to hire, demand that you have a diverse slate before you're ready to interview candidates. To amplify. So it turns out that there are ways that people's identities could make people doubt their expertise, right? So if you walk in a room, if I walked into a room, the first thought you might not have is, oh, she must be the CEO of a powerful company, right? That's the way our stereotypes work. And then when I'm listened to, I might get a little bit of skepticism when I start sharing. So one thing you can do wherever you are is to introduce people powerfully. This is my friend X. They have these credentials and this impact. When they were in high school, they ran this club. They launched a club to support women broadly defined, girls broadly defined. When you introduce people powerfully, especially people from underrepresented groups, it can help reduce the skepticism that they have to face when they're trying to share their expertise. And you can create environments that celebrate diversity. What do I mean by that? So it turns out that we have rules of engagement that we don't even realize that we use. So research shows that in a group of 8, 3 people will speak 67% of the time, which means 5 people barely get their voices heard. If you don't create norms and ground rules and rules of engagement, you may end up only hearing from 3 people when you wanted to hear from 8. So it demands intentionally creating ground rules and norms in order to create space for everybody. So I just wanted to end on this note. When I was asked to give this talk and were there anything I needed in order to make this talk attractive to me spending this time with you, I used that opportunity to say, you know, one of the things I would love is to see a street name in Palo Alto in a prominent place named after a prominent woman of color or a prominent woman activist. Imagine what it would be like to walk down Dolores Huerta's street in Palo Alto, or Yuri Kochiyama, who was a great civil rights activist, Rosa Parks Way, Sally Ride Street. Imagine little girls and boys growing up, walking down one of these streets. So when I think about my own voice and the things that I most want in the world, I want in this world a place where everyone is seen, where everyone sees themselves in leadership, in success, and that I and you, that we are active allies in making that happen, allowing our hearts to get broken sometimes in order to be able to create space for all. So I want to stop there and make sure, I was told we have time for a limited number of questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'd love to open the floor up for questions. And maybe they're already in chat.
Thank you. So if you have questions, we probably have time for 2, but if you wanted to drop it in the chat or just do a quick raise hand. I'll have plenty, so I can definitely. All right. While we're waiting, I'll just jump right in. I'll take one of them and then we'll see which other ones pop up in the chat. I love the example that you gave in terms of your parent or with your mother and talking about allyship being so important. So can you tell us a little bit more about just how the lens through which we approach the topic on inclusion really makes a difference if we're in a place of position and power? And then I see one that popped up in the chat.
Sure. We often don't realize that we think our self view is the view. So for example, I was talking to a colleague about a job description that said, based in the heart of Silicon Valley. And I said, you know, I wouldn't start our job descriptions with that for 2 reasons. Maybe there are more. One, for people who are not well represented here, it's not an advantage to move to Silicon Valley. It can feel like a disadvantage to move here. Secondly, if someone needs to commute from a longer distance, saying how important it is to be in Silicon Valley might signal to them that you can't telecommute easily, right? In all of our jobs. And we can't in all of our jobs, but in some of our jobs. And a colleague then said to me, I disagree with you. Me and my colleagues love working here physically. You are saying something can be a disadvantage when it's clearly an advantage. And then I paused and said, one of the things we said we're trying to do is to invite people in who are not currently here. What if that's one of the reasons why they're not applying for our jobs? So when you think about creating opportunities, it's not what works for me or what works for you. It's to think about, well, what doesn't work for people that's preventing them from working with us? And how can we break down those barriers? So I think as an ally, one of the skills I'm working on is perspective taking, realizing that my view is not the view, and how can I learn to see other people's views and start from there versus what works for me. And then if it means that I have to spend more money to bring someone to interview from out of state, or whatever it means, to go ahead and take those actions in order to have more equity and less sameness where we are.
Excellent.
I think Divya has her hand raised.
Yes, Divya has her hand up, and then there's two very short ones after that. So I'm going to combine them. But yes, go ahead, Divya. You can just unmute yourself.
First, I want to say thank you so much for sharing all those really critical and concrete strategies at the very end, specifically about how we can use our own networks to reflect the diversity we hope to see in opportunities. And a question I had as someone who has, I've been a big high school mall runner and debater, and something that I've experienced is I feel you when you want to say we want to introduce our friends and even ourselves with confidence and claim our space. And something I always feel like I have to balance that with is coming across as not only assertive, but aggressive and overconfident and taking up too much space. And so I'm wondering, as a woman, how do you feel like we can strike that balance of claiming our space, yet also understanding the perception of what that tends to mean for women specifically?
That's such a smart question. There's something called a likability penalty, where for women, likability and competence are negatively correlated, and for men, they're positively correlated, which means the more powerful men are, like you said, taking up space, telling you who they are, the more we like them. But when women do that, we end up disliking them, and there can be real consequences. And this is because of the past-based stereotype that we expect women to be supportive and for other people and not for themselves. So one thing you can do is notice that if you do that yourself, to stop it. So we can't help it. Sometimes when a woman says, hey, I'm this blah, blah, blah expert, we might feel that pinch ourselves. So one thing is to catch it in yourself and stop it. The second thing is, I think about sometimes negotiations as similar to introductions. Research shows that when women negotiate communally, which means on behalf of others, they do not face as much of that penalty. So for example, if I want to raise, and I say, I want to raise, I might face the penalty you're saying. But if I say, I want to grow my team to have this level of impact, and I want to hire people who are high caliber, and in order to spend that time and signal to others that my team is important, I want to be elevated to this level, and it would really serve our collective aim as an organization. So negotiating on behalf of others, it's not fair that we have to, but it does often mitigate some of that concern you're talking about. So when I think about introducing myself or others, when I talk about impact, that often can reduce others seeing me as self-promoting and seeing me more as my expertise. So if I were to say to you, my name is Lori Mackenzie, I co-founded the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Lab. We started an industrial affiliates program, which is a membership-based organization that combines community members with the university. And now that affiliates program has 60 members, and we're the second largest affiliates program on the Stanford campus. Did you feel like I was being overly aggressive and assertive? I was talking about my impact in my community. So that's one way I found for myself, and there might be other strategies, so please do go ahead and put them into chat.
Awesome. And just one last one. I'm combining two questions together
Okay.
as we wrap up and prepare for the breakout sessions. But the question was, do you think the city should have a CEDAW resolution? And then what are some of the resources that you would recommend in general on this topic?
I do believe my city, our city, should have a CEDAW resolution. And here's what it does. It signals our commitment to equity. It's a public statement of who we are. And it requires us to live our values. We know that when you make a public statement, when you're transparent, you're less likely to enact those biases. So it's a continual reminder that the practices we do take an equity lens. This is why, for example, Title IX is so important around education, to keep reminding us that we have to constantly think about equity, at least on a gender basis, in all the work that we do. So yes, I do. And resources, one is to support and be active in your community. So my husband is on, for example, the Palo Alto Citizens Council as a volunteer because he wanted to see more equity in policing. So don't think about it. He wanted to educate himself and be part of the solution. So he joined the, I got the name wrong, but like the Citizens Council. Make sure you vote. There are many organizations I see here in chat. Do you know that the YWCA is an activist place and has been really involved in creating more equity in our society? There's so many avenues to be involved. There's no right one. What I would say is start with giving up and understanding some of your own power and privilege, and bring it consistently to an organization that means. For example, I love the Alliance for Girls. I've been active with them for years. We're committed to taking an intersectional lens in supporting girls. One of the things we discovered in our own research is that schools were giving food to students who were unable to participate in lunch programs, but that they weren't giving out period products. And that most girls from marginalized community, and they're very expensive, got their period products from their schools. And so Alliance for Girls started advocating that included with the lunch program were period products for girls. That's a really meaningful change to each and every girl who was 30% of girls in San Francisco were going without period products during the pandemic. Can you imagine? So take concerted action to join one of the many organizations there are and be consistent with your support. Don't be a dabbler. Do the hard work that they need you to do to create the change that they want to create.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful wrap up of this session and just really emphasizing some of the actions that people can take. And I've seen others drop some resources in the chat and we'll continue to do that through the day.